Hello, welcome to this educational program by the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents in the USA, AFPC-USA. I'm Patricia Vasconcelos, a board member of the association, White House correspondent for SBT Brazilian TV network. Today, our intention here with this educational program is inform our colleagues, foreign journalists with knowledge about an international non-governmental organization headquartered in New York City that conducts research and advocacy on human rights. I'm talking about Human Rights Watch. The reports they produce are a frequent source for our journalistic work and serve as a guide to stories that may be not widely broadcasted or published by the media. So let's take a look in what they're doing, how we foreign journalists can learn from them. Our guest today, she's already here with us, Emma Daly, head of the Collaboratory at Human Rights Watch. Emma, thank you so much for taking this time and talk to us here from the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents in the US. Welcome.
Thank you. And I'm also a proud former foreign correspondent and journalist covering international affairs. So delighted to be with you.
Yes, Emma Daly, as I had, is the head of the Collaboratory at Human Rights Watch, an initiative to foster more effective external collaboration and impact. Her previous roles included overseeing the media department and communications team. But before joining Human Rights Watch, Emma Daly spent 18 years as a journalist, mostly as a foreign correspondent. She worked for the New York Times, The Independent, Newsweek, The Observer, and Reuters, among others. She has contributed to several books, including Secrets of the Press, the Penguin Book of Journalism, and Crimes of War, What the Public Should Know. A native of the UK, Daly graduated from the University of East Anglia with a BA in philosophy and literature. So Emma, again, welcome. It's a pleasure to talk to you. I would like to start this interview, this educational program, asking you about your journey. You worked almost 2 decades as a foreign correspondent living in Spain, in Costa Rica. You covered the Balkans, right, for so many years. What led you to this field of human rights, first as a journalist covering topics related to human rights as a foreign correspondent? What brought your attention to this topic?
So I think I started really wanting to cover human interest stories. I mean, like most journalists, I came to it because I was interested in the stories people told me. And what, of course, is so exciting about being a correspondent is the fact that you get to see people's lives. You're invited into communities that you would never otherwise have access to. And so I was interested in, just hearing the stories of people. And I don't know that I was consciously doing it, but when I look back at the stories I was covering, even in my first job, which was in Central America as a general assignment reporter, a lot of the stories that I was covering ended up being about women's rights, about children, about abuses against children, about the plight of refugees from the various Central American conflicts. And, it was really just being interested in learning about the human condition and the kind of difficulties and the challenges that people were facing, and the lives that they were living, and how people's individual lives were very much affected by the decisions made by policymakers, often thousands of miles away. And I think it took me a long time to understand that those were human rights stories. And maybe almost not even until I started working in a human rights organization, and I started to understand that while human rights is technically like the international legal systems that govern human rights, really human rights are all around us, in the air we breathe, whether it's clean or not, in the water that we drink, whether you and I are paid the same for the work that we do as the guys, what we're able to wear or not, whether we're able to access healthcare without going broke or going to jail. All of these issues, all of the things that affect our daily lives are bound up in human rights. And so I think it took me a long time to understand that, right, you know, trying to find out about people's lives and trying to find out about human stories was really also about, you know, uncovering the human rights issues affecting them.
Mhm. I was reading some of your stories years ago, you know, to see your work. So many impressive stories you wrote, Emma. For example, while working for the Independent, covering the Kosovo. One of the stories, it's from 1999, and the headline was "War in the Balkans: Children Paint Horrors from Memory." Any specific, you know, story that you covered? I know it's such a long time of your journey and your career, 2 decades, but a story that you would like to highlight, and maybe it brings to your memory that you thought, this is something that I might work in a different way. And then we comes to your transition, right? Like from being a correspondent and now working for Human Rights Watch.
Yes, I mean, I really think that my experience in the former Yugoslavia was really fundamental there, because I think, you know, working in Bosnia and then later in Kosovo, and also in Croatia and Serbia and the other countries in the former Yugoslavia. But, you know, as journalists, obviously our job is to bear witness. But what I really felt was that wasn't enough. I mean, I felt that it was the role of journalists was incredibly important, because what it meant was we were documenting what was happening in Yugoslavia in real time, in immense detail. We didn't have the social media perspective that we now have, which would have been incredible to see how Bosnians were documenting their lives in the way that we see Ukrainians, for instance, or Syrians. But at least I felt like, okay, well, at least politicians can't deny what's going on. You know, as they're making the decisions that they're making, they are seeing the effects of those decisions playing out in people's lives. So that's very valuable. But at the same time, I think for many of us in that generation, it felt like it wasn't enough, because we wanted change. We wanted not just to document what was happening, but we wanted the attacks on civilians to stop. And so that's really what led me to make the change to Human Rights Watch, because here we do spend a lot of time uncovering the facts, documenting them, using a lot of very journalistic methods. But our whole reason for being is change, is trying to advocate for an end to human rights abuses, for governments to respect the laws of war, to protect civilians, to uphold their legal obligations. And so for me, I think it was that time in journalism, really seeing the worst of what policy could bring to people's lives and how it destroyed people's lives, made me really want to move to a place where the whole point was to stop that from happening and to try to build a world where people's rights are respected, no matter who they are or where they come from.
So you made this transition, and now you were talking to us from the headquarters of the Human Rights Watch. You were in where are you now, in New York City?
Yeah, in New York City, yes.
Yes.
Our headquarters are in the Empire State Building, because when we moved here about 20 years ago, it was it happened to be a very affordable place to rent an office in New York City.
And what is the structure today of the Human Rights Watch, and your role in the institution?
Yeah, so we really think about our work in a number of ways. I mean, a really important part is the investigations. So we have researchers around the world covering, you know, dozens of countries, whose job is really to figure out what are the most critical human rights abuses, and also what are the places where we can make a difference. And they investigate and really document as well as they can what those abuses are. And if you're interested later, I can go into more of the actual methodology around that. So those are the researchers, and they are loosely structured into regional divisions. So we have an Africa team, you know, an Asia team, a Middle East and North Africa team. And they are, some of them are responsible for one country or a couple of countries, or there's a team working on a country. And then we also have what we call thematic divisions. and they are experts in children's rights or women's rights or crisis and conflict, or technology. So some people are experts and they will work on children's rights in Africa. So we have to do a lot of collaboration among those researchers. Then we also have an advocacy team, and everybody does advocacy within the organization. But we also have a team whose job is really to think about, like, how is Washington, how do we influence Washington? How do we get the US to change its policy? Or, how do we get Japan to do that? Or the African Union, somebody whose job is to think about how do we influence the African Union? How do we persuade them to see human rights differently and to be more effective in promoting human rights? We have a small but mighty legal department, which is critical to our work because they're thinking about, what does international human rights law say? What do the laws of war say? Or the regulations around business and human rights? They're looking at the legal framework and constantly asking the question, what is the human rights abuse? Who's responsible? Why do you think that that person has, legal responsibility? And they also play a little bit the role that media lawyers play, like, don't libel people, how are you, why do you feel confident making that allegation against somebody? Where's the evidence to back that up? Then we have a large communications team that is both creating content, so making videos about our work, but also running our social channels, reaching out to journalists, pitching stories to journalists, because the sort of the theory of, and I'll come into a little bit what my team does. So I guess our original theory of change was around this notion that, like, if you uncover the facts and expose them widely in the media, you can build pressure on politicians to make a change.
Okay.
And that's still true, but I think that it's become more difficult because, as we all know, facts are increasingly disputed. And
you're saying
the
that
notion
there is about doubting about the...
Well, that we know that a number of particularly authoritarian and autocratic politicians have a specific policy of putting in doubt everything. The sun is out. No, that's not true. So the whole notion of fake news, when we're struggling with, on the one hand, misinformation and disinformation, the creation of fake news deliberately to alter an election or to stop people from participating, but then simultaneously politicians dismissing as fake news anything they don't like. So if I say, well, your government is doing X, you're just like, that's not true, or I don't care anyway. And so it's been, so it's very hard in this world now to break through with actual facts and trying to persuade politicians to make a change around facts. So my team is partly thinking through, well, what are the other ways? How do we mobilize the public to put pressure on politicians? And how do we think about changing the environment and how people think about human rights? How do we make human rights more important in people's everyday lives to be more effective?
Or did you draw this new strategy, or how to influence more society rather than, all the data that Human Rights Watch provides, which is a huge source for us journalists all around the world, right? For our daily reports, for us to take a look in a situation that we might not be aware of. But when you guys you publish a report, for example, it draws our eyes to that topic, which is very important and helps a lot.
And I think that's still really fundamental, like the fact-based analysis, pulling the facts together and then building a case for why this is systematic, or why this is happening and why it matters, is still fundamental to everything we do. But I think increasingly we're also having to think about how people are receiving that information. Excuse me. So we're also engaging in projects where we're trying to think about, like, how do you how do you persuade the public to embrace human rights in some way? And I think one way of doing it that we're experimenting with now is how do we try to mainstream human rights in pop culture, for instance? Because I think if you look at if you think about the progression of LGBT rights around the world, for instance, if you just look at the United States, it was in 1996 that President Clinton signed the Defense of Marriage Act, which was very much like shutting the door on any on equality for same-sex couples, right? 20 years later, well, it was, I think, 10 years later, less than 10 years later, that the first state, created marriage equality in the United States. And I think a lot of that was that people's attitudes to LGBT people changed and were changed, for instance, by TV programs and by films and by the portrayal and representation of LGBT people as part of everyday lives. I think the same is true when you look at reproductive rights and abortion, for instance. I mean, who would think that Ireland, like an incredibly Catholic country, would vote to approve abortion rights? And I think a lot of that was done through changing people's attitudes, not just because people started to understand that they knew people directly affected, but they met people through film and television. So that's one way of changing minds. It's also, by the way, why militaries and police forces spend a lot of time working with, film and TV people to make sure that their perspective is constantly portrayed. So that's a small area of work. But I think also just, you think about how certain politicians will try to demonize groups like migrants, migrants are criminals. I mean, that's just data-wise not true. Native-born people tend to commit crimes at higher rates than migrants. But as we also know, many of our societies depend on immigrants to, they bring huge economic benefits. They help reverse declining birth rates. We're going to depend on, some of us who are older are going to depend on them to be able to pay our pensions. Actually, all the data show that migrants contribute massively to all of our societies, and yet, some politicians will try to demonize them and sort of turn people against them and talk about crises. So part of our job is to try to help people to see that those aren't true, and to not be fooled by the kind of xenophobic rhetoric that that people are using migrants as a tool. So our work has to also persuade the wider public that it's important that you also stand with people who have certain legal rights, but who are also generally making your society a better place.
It's very interesting to listen and learn all of this, because then it's for us, when we search for a specific topic, we can also draw, as I said, our attention for other places, even inside the Human Rights Watch, where to search, who to talk with. Let's talk a bit about armed conflicts. Would you say that Human Rights Watch today has an effective impact while working in places that are living this situation?
I mean, it's so difficult. I think we were one of the first organizations to really get into sort of real-time reporting of human rights in conflict. And really, the way we approach conflict is we don't look at why a conflict is being fought or whether it's just or legal. We look at how it's being fought, because we think we're more effective if we're able to report on both sides of a conflict, or all three sides of a conflict in some places. And what we're trying to do is exposing the harms to civilians and showing governments how they could be, or rebel armies or whoever it is, how they could be doing it better. And as we all know, war is horrific, but because it's so horrific, over the last 150 years, we have developed laws to try to limit sort of the harm to civilians and the unnecessary harm to civilians. And so I think our work around conflict is about trying to document what's happening in the moment, and also trying to uphold those standards and even improving the norms and standards. So, for example, we did a recent report on the destruction in Mariupol, which came out just before the second anniversary of the war in Ukraine. Now, incredible journalism has been done about and from Mariupol, including the AP's work and the documentary 20 Days in Mariupol.
Yeah, that won
the Oscar, yeah, and numerous other prizes. So journalism was critical there, and they were on the ground. What we've done was to go back and really try to dig into to count how many people were killed, to do a sort of assessment of damage, a really comprehensive assessment of the damage, which we also did some 3D modeling to try to show, and used a lot of social media videos that we verified in social media posts and comments from people in Mariupol. And then we actually built an organogram of who we think has command responsibility for the decisions that were made around Mariupol. Now, whether that will make a difference, we'll see. But what I will say is the International Criminal Court has already issued arrest warrants for 2 Russian generals involved in destructions of infrastructure, which is also something we reported on, and for attacks on children. So, sorry. So what we're trying to, the reason we're trying to highlight the abuses is to try to persuade armies in real time to fight in a more human rights friendly way, but also trying to build the case for justice in the future. And I will just say that when I was working in the former Yugoslavia, like, I could never imagine seeing Ratko Mladic or Radovan Karadzic or Slobodan Milosevic in the court, in prison, but it happened. It took 20 years, or I can't remember how many years now. It can take decades, but it can happen if we find the evidence, document it, and then keep pushing and pushing and pushing for justice, because it's really important. We can't bring back the dead, but we can give them an honest accounting, and we can give the survivors, we can have their stories heard, and we can have some kind of an accurate accounting for what happened.
I imagine I'm thinking here about the difficulties and the challenges for, institutions as Human Rights Watch and others that are on the ground in places where are facing wars or armed conflicts, to raise those data, because those people are also in danger. How difficult is it now for places like, as you said, we were talking about specifically about this report that was, highlighting the situation 2 years after the invasion in Mariupol. But is today, you think, more or less difficult than in the past?
I mean, I think we have many more tools nowadays. So, but it a little bit depends, because, for example, like the obvious place is Gaza, which everybody knows it's almost impossible to get into. News organizations and human rights organizations and others have people on the ground in Gaza. It's very, very difficult to make contact. It's, there are numerous risks that they're facing internally from, the control, both internally and externally. It's very tricky. But then look at a place like Sudan, which just passed its excuse me, we just had the 1-year anniversary of the renewed conflict in Sudan, which, it's really hard to get people in there. It's really hard to get people in, and it's really hard to get information out. Now, we have, because we've been working so long in the region, we have networks, we have contacts, we have people, and we have all these technological tools now to reach people in difficult places. Like, when I was covering wars, we didn't have cell phones, let alone like sat phones or WhatsApp, or, all these different ways that people communicate now. But I think it's really important to raise the issue of security. So there's so many different things you have to think about. Are they going to be in danger by talking to you, by having your contacts on their phone? Are they going to be at risk? We definitely don't want someone to go out and look for, attacks to be able to report back to us. So there's physical security, there's IT security, there's, reliability, like verification. We're always trying to triangulate the data that we're getting. And this is where I think some of the newer tools like satellite imagery assessment, analysis, open source video and audio, we can speak to people on the ground, and then we can look at videos posted online. We can geolocate them. We can see what time of day. We can try to cross-check and corroborate details. When we're asking people, we do a lot of face-to-face interviewing. When we're asking people about their experiences, we'll ask them questions about the weather or the time of day to try to, because there are certain things that we can verify.
Oh, okay.
That's, facts that we can verify, and then we can sort of try to cross-check. We can, if they have weapons fragments, obviously what we want to do is be on the ground and actually go and look for those weapon fragments we have arms analysts who can look and say that crater was made by this kind of a weapon. We can plot the trajectory. We can do all kinds of modeling to see who we think was responsible for a strike. But in assessing what happens within a war zone, it's also very, very complicated, because the laws of war talk about proportionality, for example. And, so it's always a matter of judgment. Was there a military target nearby? Does that make it a legitimate target? Because of course civilians can be lawfully killed in conflict as well, but too often they're unlawful. So going forward, for instance, we have had numerous campaigns in the past, like to ban landmines, to ban cluster munitions, and now we're working on trying to get governments to limit the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. Because what we find is that they're dropping these bombs with like huge blast radiuses in very densely populated areas. So maybe there was a legitimate military target, but you're dropping a weapon on it that has like a devastating impact across a wide area. And so one of the things we're working on will be a campaign to try to get a treaty to ban those kinds of weapons. So I'm sorry, your original question, like, is it easier or harder? Maybe it's harder. It's a little bit like journalism. You used to be able to go into a place and then you'd come out and your reporting wouldn't necessarily be seen. Now everybody knows.
Right. Everywhere it's easier to find.
Exactly.
And there are
but at the same time, we have more tools to reach people remotely, and we have more ability to do remote reporting. But you just have to be even more careful that you understand who you're talking to, what their agenda is, what their knowledge level is, that it's not, it's not my cousin told me.
Of course.
It's like I actually saw it myself.
Primary source. And so that's why it's so important to listen and learn all of this information, Emma, because this is a tiny example, I think, of the extremely complex, structure that, for example, Human Rights Watch that we are talking today have to build those reports. As you said, that one of the main challenges today is to deal with, doubts and that is raising all around the world, that is affecting us journalists, and I believe in serious institutions as Human Rights Watch. We as foreign journalists, as I said at the very beginning, we rely very much in the reports as a reliable source for our, daily work. If we go through the website, we can find the most recent reports that Human Rights Watch produced. Could you highlight any story from the United States that might be, an idea for colleagues that are watching us or listening to us, because it's going to be also published in our Foreign Press podcast. So a recent story that we might, take a look here in the US.
Thanks. So I think one of the things that we're often trying to do, and what we use journalistic methods, but we often go further. So it's very normal for us to speak to 40, 50, 100 people for a report. But we're often trying to tell the individual stories that expose a kind of pattern of abuses or a system of abuses. And one recent, I think, very interesting report we did in the US was about a place called Cancer Alley in Louisiana. And that's a sort of a 50-mile stretch between New Orleans and Baton Rouge, where there is a huge number of petrochemical industries and oil industry. And not at all by coincidence, all of these are placed in Black communities. You will not be shocked to hear. And, you know, the communities there have been struggling for years to try to claim their rights and to demand action. What this area has, I think, 7 times the rate of cancer compared to the rest of the US. Our researcher went in and found also like a lot of really awful health harms to newborns, to pregnant women, to, you know, new mothers. It's really the climate crisis is a human rights crisis, and the sort of horrific harms that come when you live close to the petrochemical industries, you know, were really detailed in the lives of these people. They, you know, she talks to people who can't think of anyone. They look around, they're like, who hasn't been affected by cancers? And they can't think of anyone. And you know, this is something you see replicated around the world. Now, one of our goals is to end the use of fossil fuels. And before we get to that point, to make sure that we are regulating them very, very strongly to limit the harms. So we're trying to take the stories of these people in Louisiana to show how bad it is, but also to show how easy it is in a way to fix. Like, you just need to stop doing business the way that you're doing it right now. And interestingly, the Biden administration, just a couple of weeks ago, has introduced a set of new regulations that actually should improve the lives of people in Cancer Alley. And it's something that they have been demanding for years. So I do want to also say that, you know, almost all of our work starts with the people most affected. And we really try to listen to them and partner with them to ask what it is that they want to see differently. So people in Cancer Alley have been demonstrating and advocating for years. And what we're trying to do is, you know, through our reporting and our advocacy, try to work with them and amplify those voices demanding change. And it's been great to see this progress on the kind of industrial rules. But there's a lot more that can be done, and I think all of our futures depend on it.
So this is a report about, as you said, the Cancer Alley that impacts the life of so many in Louisiana. And there is also a report, a recent one I saw, there is about the Darien Gap. It's a topic that many colleagues are covering, or from here, even from Washington, D.C., those who travels, you know, to the border, or to Central and South America. I imagine this is an important report too that might help us, right, in our work, because many of us I'm here in Washington, D.C., and this is a topic that we might be there to actually, you know, cover this stuff.
Absolutely. And I think you know, and this is the thing that we're documenting, the kind of abuses that migrants face along the routes. Like, there was a lot of sexual violence in that last report, a lot of extortion, you know, and then just horrendous bureaucracy at the border. As you know, people have a right to claim asylum, and there should be an effective process in place for them to do that. That has been very much disrupted. We've seen, like, Texas, for instance, the state of Texas create an incredibly abusive and militarized kind of border operation. So there's so much going on at the southern border, but it's also and on that route coming up. And then, you know, we need all of these governments to take it seriously and to cooperate together and to create a humane, safe place where people can seek asylum and can make those claims in a way that they're not kind of putting their lives and health at such risk. But I think it requires, it's by the way, it's something that we're seeing kind of all over the world as well. It's obviously not an issue that's unique to the US, but it's also, I think, just, it's such an important issue here, in part because this country so much depends on migrant labor and on immigrants' entrepreneurial spirits, and the importance of, I mean, of course, this country, was founded on on immigration, and we do spend a little bit of time also trying to think about the rights of the indigenous people in the United States. But I think for all of us living here, it would really, some kind of like ideally bipartisan legislation to really reform the horrendously broken immigration system would go a long way to ending those kinds of abuses, and to help would-be migrants to ensure that they don't have to undertake such incredibly dangerous journeys. And also, I mean, the thing is, people don't do this for fun. Like, nobody people know how dangerous the Darien Gap route is and how difficult it is and just how hard it is to make that crossing. People know that, and they still come. And why do they come? Because where they're living is untenable. They don't see a future for their children. They're afraid. They're being persecuted. For whatever reason, they need to get out. It is not a decision that anyone takes lightly. It's extraordinarily difficult. And the people who make it through are some of the most resilient and creative, and I think strong people that I personally would love to have as my fellow, citizens wherever I was living.
Emma, we are almost finishing our chat here. I'm so glad we had this, opportunity to listen and learn from you. To finalize, I would like to ask if you have anything to add and to say to our colleagues, foreign journalists, who worked so many years, covering countries abroad for big media outlets, and now in charge as a head of the Collaboratory at Human Rights Watch. Mainly as, your personal view as our work, how can we as foreign journalists contribute, in partnership, or not only accessing the data from institutions as Human Rights Watch, but, how we can be more productive in raising attention to important topics related to human rights.
I mean, we love for you to come to us. We have a generic email, which is hrwpress@hrw.org, and that's the press desk. They're a great first point of call. It's staffed almost 24/7-ish. But get on make sure that you're on our relevant press lists where we're sending out our work. But also, just reach out to us and say, I'm thinking about doing this, or I'm interested in this area, because often we can connect you with, like our fossil fuels researcher who did the Louisiana report. There's tons of things she can't cover, but she has lots of ideas. She's actually a former journalist as well. So you meet her and you have coffee with her, and then you'll have like 5 story ideas. The same for the immigration team, or our team working on racial justice. We're doing a lot of work in Florida with our partners around sort of trying to end educational censorship in Florida around,
this is an important topic too, of course.
Yeah, not teaching, not being allowed to teach racism or, LGBT rights. So, I hope in the best ways we're a resource. And then the other thing is, if you see things happening, let us know. And finally, sorry, a third thing I will say is also we're in touch with so many other nonprofits and working in all sorts of different areas. So often we don't know what you need to know, but we often know somebody who does. So we can connect you with our partners or other organizations working in a space or a place that we aren't, or who are just better placed to talk. So I think that's the thing. Like, come to us with your questions, and we'll try to connect you with the right people. And thank you for all the work, because it's obviously really important that this country, which is so influential, is effectively covered.
Of course, I'm so glad we had the opportunity to talk. I'm so glad I had this, opportunity to interview you, Emma. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for giving me the chance.
I spoke today with Emma Daly, head of the Collaboratory at Human Rights Watch, a former foreign correspondent. Thank you all for joining us in this educational program. See you next time.